Secretary General Guterres, hello.
Hello, it's a great pleasure to be with you.
And thank you for joining us. I want to start with the pandemic, if I can. You have said that vaccination in the world has been, quote, wildly uneven and unfair. For instance, more than 100 countries have yet to receive a single dose. How concerned are you about vaccine nationalism?
Now, I'm very concerned with this very unfair distribution of vaccines in the world. I mean, I'm privileged. I'm in New York. I was already vaccinated according to the rules of the country for residents that they generously also extended to UN staff. But indeed, most of our staff around the world is in countries where vaccination has not yet started. And it's not only unfair, it's not only a matter of justice, it's also a matter of enlightened self-interest, namely in the developed world. Because we are seeing how this virus mutates. And as much as it spreads, as much as it mutates. So even if the global north, when they will be fully vaccinated, if the global south is not, and if the virus is going on spreading in the global south, at a certain moment, the mutations will not only lead to what we are already witnessing in relation to being more easily to transmit, being eventually more lethal, but also putting into question the efficiency of the vaccines that exist, which means that all of a sudden, a global north fully vaccinated will again be vulnerable to the new variants of the virus. So it's in the interest of everybody to make sure that as soon as possible and in a fair way, everybody gets vaccinated everywhere, and that vaccines are considered to be a truly global public good.
So one of the ways to get that vaccine equity is through COVAX, which Canada has contributed to. However, Canada has also taken vaccines from COVAX, which it's allowed to do. But I wonder whether you think ethically or morally that is what nations should be doing with COVAX.
Now, first of all, we are having difficulties with COVAX in relation to the supply of vaccines because there has been a lot of hoarding of vaccines. There are limitations to export and situations of the sort. So we are in a very difficult situation with COVAX itself that is also not yet fully funded. But here I have a principle of equality. I mean, all members of the COVAX have the right to have their own quota of vaccines. The problem is not that some developed countries get those vaccines. The problem is to make sure that COVAX is fully funded and that the quotas of the developing countries are fully respected. So I'm not worried by the fact that COVAX also, that Canada also has the right to have some COVAX vaccines. What I'm worried is that COVAX is not big enough, COVAX is not supported enough, and that we are unfortunately having a very difficult time to make sure that the vaccines get everywhere as soon as possible.
Canada is ramping up, obviously, inoculations. It expects to receive 118 million doses of the vaccine by the end of September. At what point do you want to see countries like Canada giving doses away to developing nations?
Now, what we have been telling to countries, namely in the developed world, and I understand I was government in my country for 6.5 years. I mean, and governments are under enormous pressure to protect their own citizens. This is obvious everywhere. But what we have been telling governments, namely in developed countries, is first, don't stockpile vaccines. I mean, it doesn't make sense to have vaccines stockpiled. Then, if you have vaccines stockpiled, move them to countries that, through COVAX, that need them. And second, I mean, it is not the best strategy to vaccinate everybody in one country before those most vulnerable or frontline workers are not vaccinated in the global south, everywhere. Because, again, it then becomes a danger even for the populations that have been vaccinated. Right. So we have been appealing to developed countries to share some of the vaccines that they have bought. And in many situations, they have bought more than what they need. Of course, there are problems of supply in the way it happens. To share those and to do it as quickly as possible, namely in relation to the priority areas of vaccination in the developing countries.
Our government has talked about, our Prime Minister has talked about the need for a vaccine passport internationally. Do you see concerns around that? He has expressed concerns around the equity of that, but he does see a utility for it. What are your thoughts on the need for a vaccine passport?
It's a very controversial question. I've been reading a large number of arguments in favor, a large number of arguments against. I think that before any of these measures is taken, there must be a serious discussion in order to guarantee the equity and in order to guarantee that there is effective international cooperation on how to do it. Because the worst is for some countries to have it, for other countries not to have it, for some to recognize, to others not to recognize. And especially it would be devastating if this would mean that people could move within the developed world, but not within the developing world. So again, we need to find the right balance in relation to the possibility of accelerating the economic recovery and the equity that is necessary in a world that is still, as we all know, very unfair in the way we are responding to the COVID.
You are meeting with our Prime Minister on Monday to talk more about development and I believe a post-COVID world. How worried are you about some of the poorest nations and their recovery from the pandemic?
Well, first of all, I want to pay tribute to Prime Minister Trudeau and the Prime Minister of Jamaica, because it was thanks to their common leadership in cooperation with us that it was possible to put for the first time clearly in the UN agenda the questions of financing for sustainable development. And we are, of course, very worried because there are serious problems of liquidity and serious problem of debt in the developing countries that are undermining their capacity to recover their economies after the COVID. As we have said, that in relation to debt, we need to have the present initiatives that were approved by the G20 in relation to debt suspension to be generalized to all countries in need, including middle-income countries, and to be extended. We asked for 2 years in the beginning. That would mean the middle of 2022. I hope that we'll get there. And to have debt relief and a mechanism that mobilizes the private sector. And finally, I believe, and we have been asking for that, and there is a lot of work being put in place, that it's time to start thinking about a new global debt architecture. And as I said, I'm extremely grateful to Prime Minister Trudeau, because as a member of the G7 and as a member of the G20, Canada was absolutely vital in mobilizing the international community, and especially those countries that have more power in the definition of economic rules in the world, mobilizing them to understand the need to be much more proactive in support of the developing world in the response to COVID-19.
Let me end on this, Secretary General. How long do you think it is going to take the world to recover from what we have been living through over the past year and a bit?
I think it depends a lot on having the possibility to vaccinate as quickly as possible the population all over the world. If we manage, and we have asked for a global vaccination plan and for an emergency task force in the G20 to develop and coordinate its implementation, the instruments we have now are not powerful enough. The World Health Organization has done a fantastic job, but they have not the power to force countries to do anything. They can, of course, advise, they can recommend, but we need a mechanism, empowered mechanism by the G20 to have a global vaccination plan. And if that takes place, and if we are able to vaccinate everybody everywhere, and we also need to increase the capacity of production. There are questions of license, questions of technological support. Many other countries have the capacity to produce, but the licenses are not available, yes. And the technical support is not. If we do all that, I believe we will be able to recover our economies very fast. And I hope that that recovery will be different from the past, that it will be inclusive and sustainable. And it's very clear that there is a growing consciousness of that need. If we leave half of the world without enough vaccines, if we have several new variants coming, and the waves one after the other, and vaccines become not so effective, then I believe we might have a problem for the next few years that would be extremely, extremely difficult to manage. So, for me, vaccination, global vaccination is the best condition to allow for a speedy recovery of our economies.
Secretary General, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
It's a great pleasure.